Another US tariff deadline. We've heard it all before. The next one is on August 1st.
The August 1st is there for everyone. The deals all start on August 1st.
And it's the latest attempt by the US to secure trade agreements with key global economies and bring in more revenue for the US. Take Monday's deal between the US and the EU.
We've reached a deal on tariffs and trade with the United States.
They avoided a trade war by agreeing that the EU would pay 15% tariffs on most goods, half the rate that Trump had threatened.
Today's deal creates certainty in uncertain times.
And he still got what he wanted: billions of dollars in investments in US energy and weapons.
It delivers stability and predictability.
But other big shifts are also taking place. US tariffs are pushing international exporters to find more reliable trade partners. Countries in the Middle East are stepping up to the plate. Let's look at the UAE. Since 2022, it's agreed on 27 free trade deals that reduce tariffs and remove trade bottlenecks, while the US deals are adding them. We can also look at India. The US slapped 26% tariffs on Indian exports in April, which threatened its $32 billion jewelry industry. Now, India is looking to tap into a market in Saudi Arabia, or China, which is eyeing the possibility of moving its car manufacturing to countries like Morocco that have free trade agreements with both the US and Europe, and in Gulf-based economic zones that secure more free trade. So what's the impact of these shifts on global trade? Do they have the ability to reduce dependence on trading with the US? That's what we're here to explore today on Business Extra. I'm your host, Salim Essaid. To help us make sense of what's happening, I'm speaking with Simon Evennet, a professor of geopolitics and strategy at the IMD Business School in Stockholm. Simon, welcome to Business Extra.
Great to be back here. Thanks.
Can you start off by telling us if we're seeing a shift away from Western markets due to tariffs, and which Middle East countries are emerging as alternatives?
Because of the high US tariffs, there was a big fear that exports would be redirected to third markets, including the Gulf. Tariffs, of course, reached astronomical levels on Chinese goods into the United States, and so that fear was articulated, especially with hyper-competitive Chinese products. Having looked into the data for the first 6 months of this year, the Chinese export data, there is some of this going on, but not very much. So my estimate for the Middle East region in general is that about $2.2 billion of Chinese exports have been redirected, which is no more than maybe 2% of the region's imports from China in terms of an increase. It amounts to about 4.2 days worth of extra imports in the first half of the year. So it's not a significant factor up until now.
In terms of volume.
In terms of value and volume. But that doesn't mean that once the tariffs stick, if they do stick, we might start getting bigger effects, and it won't just be redirection of Chinese products. There could be others too. So what that means then is essentially the hunt for new customers is underway for those firms who have been frustrated in exporting to the United States, or who will be frustrated in exporting to the United States. And then the question then is, to what extent will this region absorb those imports as well as other regions in the world?
So when you're saying particular Middle East countries, can you specify which ones are the main receivers or who are becoming the most likely alternative partners?
So these are, of course, which countries are receiving the most of these Chinese imports. So this would be
China or elsewhere as well, like you think as a result of Trump's tariffs.
I think it's principally at the moment a Chinese redirection effect, if there is one. So it's going to be the bigger jurisdictions within the region, bigger economies. So this will be the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and UAE, principally, I would say, are the two biggest. Even with those two, it's fairly small. So at the moment, there's no need for red lights to be going off in economic ministries and trade ministries, but the people will watch this issue really carefully.
And that's it, because for me, what I say about this, as you said, it's maybe not high in volume at the moment, only 2% when it comes to China. But is this the beginning of a potential trend? The idea that as a result of tariffs, countries are starting to look at alternative partners, and these are the first steps of building maybe long-term relationships that grow even further.
So I think that's right. I think that we have to differentiate between the immediate reaction, which I just summarized, and what will unfold over the months and years ahead, where I think countries have now appreciated that the US market is not quite as open as it was, and there's no guarantee that it'll remain open no matter what happens with these particular deals. And so I think there's a sense that the US market offers fewer opportunities for expansion in the future, and therefore there's a need to find newer markets, which then I think will lead many firms as well as governments to look at countries that they might not have prioritized in the past and said, wait a minute, maybe we need to have another look. And when that happens, then of course the Gulf region's very well placed. Plus, whether it's UAE or GCC together, the region has been gearing itself up for signing more free trade agreements. There's certainly been more investment agreements that we've seen within the region as well as between regional partners and other countries. So these types of economic tie-ups, I think you'll see many more of.
And are there certain markets within the Middle East that are more appealing as a result? So, for example, India was looking to Saudi Arabia, given that it has I believe it's about 25% tax on their exports to the US when it comes to jewelry. So they're looking at Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, growing population, untapped market. Like, which markets do you see, and from which countries, where do you find there's the most potential when exporters are looking to Middle East countries as an alternative?
I think there's 3 ways to break that down. So in the B2C markets, the jewelry example is a good motivating case. So essentially find all the things that aspirational middle class people want to buy, right? So maybe they've had a TV, now they want a flat screen TV. Find the stuff that middle class people want to upgrade into and sell to them. And this region in that sense is doing exceptionally well in pulling people into those spending categories. The second area must surely be for this region looking for the firms abroad which help or supply the firms which are building infrastructure here, because there is still an enormous amount of investment going on, whether it's cities or ports or airports or infrastructure linking all of those 3 things. Yep. So I think that's another market. And then the final market, of course, is going to be the firms which are supplying the sectors which are the targets or the focus of national industrial policies. And here the region has a number of very ambitious plans which are underway. Yep. So I think these are all the areas which one would look at. I suppose the other thing I would add to all of this is, and this is something which gets lost in the whole tariff discussion, is that one type of export doesn't get hit with tariffs, and yet is the type of export that people tend to spend more and more on as they get richer, and that's services. Cross-border trade in services has been booming much faster than goods. It was booming well before the Trump tariffs. It also has, with the exception of the pandemic, where there was, of course, a big reduction in cross-border transport and cross-border tourism, digitally delivered services in particular are surging. And I think finding creative ways to expand offerings to customers who have iPhones, smartphones, and can engage through those media, these are clearly another expanding market.
So irrelevant of the tariffs, this was something that was already growing.
Sure, and people might turn around, and I think the tariffs get a lot of attention, but they only affect trading goods. And so all those firms which have been scaling up exporting services aren't necessarily directly affected unless, of course, there's some goods tie-in with what they're doing.
You mentioned China before, and we're seeing that Chinese firms are pivoting more towards the Middle East to enter Middle East markets and also re-export routes. Can you talk about how they're doing that and which countries they're targeting with that?
So let's discuss the re-export angle, because this has become sensitive and will remain sensitive. Some perspective here really helps. During the first US-China trade war, a number of Chinese firms and a number of Western firms who were producing in China decided to move their production facilities to Southeast Asia, whether it was Thailand or Vietnam or Cambodia. And so there were re-exports from those countries to the United States, in particular, some say from Vietnam. And so that playbook was followed. Those countries in Southeast Asia started seeing much larger trade surpluses with the United States. And now in the second time round, the US has picked up on this. Right? This can easily be tracked in the data. There's compelling World Bank research showing that this essentially relocation of production was taking place, and that essentially it was Chinese firms or previously Chinese located firms which were moving. Sure. So the idea would be Suppose you were exporting a television from China, you could, rather than make it entirely in China and ship it to the United States, you could send lots of parts and components to Vietnam, have it assembled in Vietnam, and then shipped to the United States.
And what's the benefit of that?
The benefit to doing that is to avoid the high tariffs being charged on exports to the US from China. And if Vietnam's tariffs are lower, then of course you can benefit from the saving of the tariffs. But of course, there's a transport cost associated with shipping the parts and components from China to Vietnam. And then, of course, you've got to assemble the goods in Vietnam. And so the concern with on the American side is that essentially lower tariff locations like Vietnam were being used to circumvent the high tariffs which were imposed during the first trade war. This time around, the Americans have said enough is enough. We're not going to do any of that. And we're not going to let that happen. And so they have insisted in their agreements with countries like Vietnam that this does not happen. And then they say they're going to put in place procedures which will try and ensure this. Now, of course, there's nothing special about Southeast Asia here as a re-export location. You could re-export from UAE, you could re-export from Morocco. There, in fact, have been concerns about re-exporting from Morocco to the United States of Chinese products. And there are other locations as well where the Chinese could, or in fact, anyone facing higher tariffs could, in principle, do this. And what the Americans are doing to crack down on this is basically to say the following: if you're an exporter from the UAE, and you want to pay the UAE tariff into the US, you have to prove that the product or enough of the product was made in the UAE. And so this then generates paperwork requirements, forcing firms to document where their supplies came from, were they domestically sourced, and so on. And that adds significantly to the complication of running a supply chain, sourcing. It affects sourcing decisions, all of these things. And so I suspect we'll see less of this redirection going forward if the Americans follow through on their promise to monitor what they call origin. It's called determining the origin of a product, whether a product that is exported from the UAE comes from the UAE, right, or is made in the UAE. And so that way of circumventing the really high tariffs, which we saw earlier in the first Trump term, that is over.
And looking at other regional markets, so we've heard reports of like Turkey, Morocco with manufacturing, Egypt with agriculture. Where else are you seeing opportunities? So I'm very interested in the services aspect, like that, and I wonder if those countries, in addition to their more physical goods, also maybe have other services that they're offering globally.
So I think on services in general, again, it's not the only driver, but language is a very important driver. For the longest time, people thought that East Africa had an advantage in back office services to the English-speaking world. And so if you were looking at a country like Morocco, you would then ask, okay, what other countries speak the languages which are spoken in Morocco, so presumably French, right? So that might be less advantageous in shipping services to the US market. Morocco is often spoken of a reshipment point for manufactured goods because, of course, it has a free trade agreement with the United States. Turkey, of course, is just an amazingly entrepreneurial society, does all sorts of stuff with all sorts of people, incredible location. So it's not surprising that some very entrepreneurial people have found the geographical position and the network of ties that Turkey has exceptionally attractive. Again, I think this is one of these linchpin trades, which I think will come to the fore. It'll be interesting to see in this region whether that's other countries grow into this. Of course, this is a region where there have been great ties over the centuries to different parts of the world. So then the question is whether the scale can be built. The Turks have scale, given their size. And if scale is important, then it clearly favors some countries in this region over others, some economies over others. But there again, the other critical mass can be engineered over time. We've seen that in Dubai. I think this is possible. And it would be very interesting to see if other of the economies which are small with smaller populations can carve out segments for themselves.
And as you mentioned, that the region is growing in terms of its global partners with the UAE, with its free trade agreements, different countries, that's only growing. And looking at where we are now, it might seem still minuscule in terms of the shift that's happening from particularly China to the Middle East, as you said, 2%. But then when we're looking at the long run, what do you think this is a sign of? What are we looking at when we're looking at the next 5 to 10 years? Are we seeing the beginning of monumental shifts that will happen later on, and we're just watching the early steps of that?
So quite possibly, yes. And let me paint a scenario. So We have, of course, the US turning inwards and acting largely for geopolitical reasons and security reasons to try and rebuild its industrial base. We have China, which has since 2015 been pursuing a policy of reducing its import dependence in a number of key areas. And so we have these two big behemoths who are not quite the engines of world trade that they used to be. We have a Europe which is still open, but not growing very fast. And then the growth is concentrated in a lot of exciting and interesting areas, this region being one of them, Africa being another exciting region, ASEAN being a very exciting region as well. And then who knows how India will work out. In all of these cases, I wish them the best. So then if you were thinking 5 or 10 years from now, if you're doing a future back analysis looking at 2035, where does your company or your government want to be, you would probably reorder where you think the weight of spending is in the world economy away from those other locations to the faster growing ones that I just talked about. And so with that reordering will come, I think, a new set of commercial arrangements. I don't think we will see the same level of binding trade deals that we've had in the past. I think there will be trade deals. I think there will be attempts to develop understandings which make business conditions more stable, more predictable. So I think governments will prioritize stability, but not necessarily low trade barriers. If they have to choose between the two, they'll probably go for stability. Some will want both. And a lot of those objectives will be pursued in looser agreements than the old style trade agreements that we saw in the 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I think we'll go to a new era a new phase of globalization, probably centered around these growth poles, probably more regional in focus, more region to region, less legalistic, but still incredibly interesting. And the human imperative to trade, which has existed for thousands of years, and this region knows that better than anyone else.
Would you find it less centralized, say, to the US or Europe, and maybe more balanced, like where usually the not as powerful economic country would get more from the deal in the future?
So let me put the point differently. I think we'll end up somewhere like that, but for the following reasons, which is that none of the big, faster growing powers that we talked about earlier, that I mentioned earlier, are ones that I think really want to sign particularly intrusive legal commitments concerning their economic and regulatory policies. So countries like India, for example, I think these are countries which are willing to do trade deals, but not the type of deep trade deals that the EU and others wanted. So if they're in for deals which are less intrusive, less binding, then these are ones which are possibly going to be will appear to be a lot more balanced or even-handed, right? So you will not have any of these dynamics of, well, the EU insisting that you have a competition law, which is like their competition law. That won't happen. That would be demoted as a negotiating priority. So I think the agreements will look very different. There was always going to be size considerations in these trade deals. So yeah, I'm afraid Oman negotiating, if it were to negotiate an FTA with India, would find that India probably has a few more cards in their hands. So those things are not going to go away. But some of the older points of contention will go away. And I think this may even make these types of cross-border tie-ups more acceptable to populations.
It wouldn't lean on the side of the usual suspects, I guess, getting most of the benefit. And
No, I think there will be a sense that it'll be a lot more balanced form. I think in that sense will be a lot more organic form of globalization rather than a legalistic driven one.
Okay, that's a great point to leave it at, positivity for the future. Yeah. So thanks so much for speaking to us. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Business Extra from The National. Make sure to check out The National's podcasts wherever you stream. Also, help improve our podcast by taking our 2-minute listener survey. You can find the link in this episode's show notes. This episode was produced by Yasmin El-Taji. Arthur Edison is our audio engineer. Our podcast editor is Duat Farid. And I've been your host, Salim Essaid.